As Chair of the Faculty of Economics, let me welcome you to the 23-24 Marshall Lectures. Let me first say a few words concerning the organization of these lectures. So after my introductory remarks, Professor Manski will present his first Marshall Lecture, which should be approximately of 1 hour's duration. And then tomorrow we're going to reconvene at the same time at 5 o'clock for the second of Professor Manski's Marshall Lectures. This will be followed by a half an hour in which the audience will have the opportunity to put questions and comments to the speaker. So if you have burning questions, please keep them till tomorrow. The Marshall Lectures are among the oldest public lectures in economics anywhere. The first was given in 1933, and this will be the 80th in the series. Of the 79 lectures so far, a total of 25 individuals have gone on to win the Nobel Prize, including this year's winner, Claudia Goldin, who presented here in 2001, and I can see some people will remember the presentation. So Charles Manski received his PhD in economics from MIT, and his first job was at Carnegie Mellon University. After that, he worked at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he was the director of the Institute for Poverty from 1988 to 1991. He has been the Board of Trustees Professor in Economics at Northwestern University since 1997. He has been awarded many prizes and honors throughout his career. He was elected Fellow of the Econometric Society in 1984, National Academy of Sciences in 2009, and he's been a corresponding Fellow of the British Academy since 2014. He was elected a Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association in 2017 and was awarded the Doctor Honoris Causa from the Hebrew University in 2018. So throughout his career, Professor Manski has made seminal contributions to a wide range of topics. His work on social interactions, which include models of peer effects, has been particularly influential. His analysis of these questions have had a profound effect on applied work in economics, but also in sociology and public health, where social externalities are rife. We often hear about the need for evidence-based policy analysis in this country, and this is commonly presented in the format of what Professor Manski has termed incredible certitude. That is, if you do X, then Y will follow. One theme of Professor Manski's work is about how to convey uncertainty about such statements and dispute the credibility of any such inferences. In particular, his work on partial identification is particularly noteworthy and continues to shape the way we approach important policy questions. He has, of course, written many articles in top journals, but also 8 books that present more fully his arguments on particular topics such as patient care under uncertainty, college choice in America, and the war on drugs. We're privileged to have Professor Charles Manski with us today to share his insights and expertise on credible social planning under uncertainty. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to a distinguished scholar and a true professor in the field of economics, Professor Charles Manski.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I'm pleased to be here. I've been looking forward to it for some months. In fact, for a few years. I come to the UK regularly, at least I did until the pandemic. But this is my first trip back since that began. It's good to be able to see everyone in person again rather than on Zoom, although Zoom is good too for its purposes. So the topic is social planning under uncertainty. I could trace this all the way back to the beginning of my career. I won't go back that far, but it's the program of research I'll talk about actually began in a sustained way around 2000 or so, and is still gathering steam as far as I can see. I have limited time to talk about it, and so in the 2 lectures, what I've chosen to do is today to give a very broad introduction. And this is going to be a totally non-technical talk, very unusual for an econometrician to give a talk without any mathematics. But that's what's going to be today. And it's going to be challenging in a way because it has to cover a breadth of fields. My own home field is econometrics, and the partial identification work that Oliver mentioned is central to what I'll discuss. But the other two fields in which I'll be drawing equally heavy, one is on public economics theory, or welfare economics, and the other is decision theory, or the more applied aspects of decision theory. And I'm trying to integrate the three. It's easy in my head. They all go together very well. It may not be easy depending on your background, because these are three fields that historically don't talk with one another very much. And part of what I'm trying to do, in addition to look at very specific kinds of public policy and related problems, is to try to push the idea that these fields should be integrated and related to one another to the degree that they haven't been. So this first talk is on credible social planning under uncertainty. Is going to be very broad. Tomorrow I will I have to flesh things out, so I've chosen one particular theme, which is diversification of treatment choice under ambiguity. So that will be tomorrow, and so that will actually have a bit of math in it, but pretty light. And just as an illustrative application, I'll talk about some work I did on tuberculosis diagnosis and treatment. There's a bit more time in the schedule tomorrow, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to touch on some of the many other specific topics tomorrow afternoon as well. And I have to say, it's very unusual for an economist to be able to talk for up to an hour without being interrupted. The norm in our profession is to interrupt within the first 30 seconds. So, but I'm going to take advantage of this and just go on. So, credible social planning under uncertainty. I'm going to try to start with outer layers of something and then peel back the layers and get deeper and deeper into it as we go along. The very first layer is some quotes. When I was thinking about social planning and social welfare and so on, I decided, well, what are some central documents, and what do they say? Well, I'm American, so I hadn't really paid much attention to this before, but the preamble of the Constitution of the United States states, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and do this and this and this, and promote the general welfare." So that's right there in the preamble of the Constitution, that's an aim of this founding document. Of course, the Constitution doesn't define the general welfare, but the term is right there. I next thought, well, these are the Marshall Lectures, so I thought, what did Alfred Marshall say about this? And Marshall's Principles of Economics, this is literally the first sentence, is political economy or economics. And for those students who aren't aware, back when Marshall was writing, political and economy and economics were integrated fields and didn't separate until afterwards, is a study of mankind and the ordinary business of life, examines that part of individual and social action most closely connected with the attainment and with the use of the material requisites of well-being. He doesn't say welfare, he says well-being, but that's close enough. The third quote I have here is from something much more recent, a report on clinical practice guidelines from the Institute of Medicine in the United States. And this is written by medical doctors, but the language sounds very economic. It says clinical practice guidelines are statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care. So that are informed by systematic review of evidence and assessment of benefits and harms of alternative care options. Now, if you read the IOM book, a very long book on clinical practice guidelines, up front it talks about optimizing patient care, so I wanted to thumb through it and find their optimization models and what their first and second order conditions are, but that is not in the this is a medical volume, and so they don't actually formalize optimization at all. Now, the reason I mention that is because all of these documents, whether it be the IOM study or Marshall or the U.S. Constitution, they're rhetorical in the discussion of optimizing patient care or the general welfare or well-being. They don't really flesh those out in those short quotes. And of course, we've got to get beyond rhetorical appeal. And so that requires answering several questions, which are indeed very difficult questions. First, what constitutes social welfare? Second, what are the feasible actions? What's the choice set in economics terms? And third, what's known about the welfare consequences of alternative choices? And that's exactly where the uncertainty is going to come in. We can set up, economists love to set up maximization problems, and you can set up a maximization problem for maximizing social welfare. It's a well-defined objective if you know enough about the welfare consequences of alternative choices to determine an unambiguous best action. It is ill-defined if the consequences are sufficiently uncertain that no action is clearly best. And that's exactly the very hard problem that has been my focus, is on how are you going to make, or what's a sensible way of making societal decisions in settings where you don't know enough to be able to set up and solve a maximization problem. Now, one would think, at least I would have hoped, that public economics theory would have dealt with the uncertainties in public policy from the very beginning of the field, that this should have been natural and central for the last couple of centuries. But that has not been the case at all. There's long traditions from late 1700s on at least to imagine policy choice by an actual or hypothetical social planner who aims to maximize welfare in a democracy, or at least some political system where welfare is intended to express the values of a society rather than the preferences of a dictator. I mean, it's not a difficult problem if there's a true dictator who just does whatever they want. But the real problem is that the social planner, whether it's a real one or a hypothetical one, is supposed to express the values of a society. So that makes it things hard. We call that welfare economics. That's the formal term that's been used for a long time. If you're a layperson, not an economics student or faculty member, then you may just call it benefit-cost analysis or cost-benefit analysis. Those are kind of lay terms from this. Now, economists often study planning with utilitarian welfare functions. Goes back to Jeremy Bentham in the late 1700s. You don't have to. A lot of my own work is utilitarian, but it doesn't have to be. We sometimes express a form of paternalism, principles of fairness, justice, or equity as well. And I'll say a bit about that as we go on. Now, the motivations for studying planning are most transparent when there is an actual physical planner. The kind of canonical cases of that are a national government that has to design an income tax, develop national defense, and so on. At the local level, governments maintain roads, perform policing, organize public education, and do many other such things. So you can actually isolate, that's the social planner in that context. But it doesn't have to be public policy. I want you to think about the term social planning and social planner more broadly as to any entity, individual or entity, that takes on the role of making decisions on behalf of some group. So I've been doing quite a lot of work in the past 10, 12 years on clinical decision-making in medicine. And it becomes natural for me to think of a clinician as a social planner making medical choices on behalf of patients. It's kind of a fruitful way to think of clinical decision-making from an economic perspective. And then if you're a labor economist, then we're always thinking about households and parents making decisions on behalf of their families. Well, the parents are the social planners acting on behalf of their families. So in these settings, there is some actual planner, and we want to analyze this as maximizing some idea of welfare. Now, the notion of a social planner has been central in economics, even in the many situations where there is no entity that's a planner, that's just an idealization of a social planner, when we're studying non-cooperative societal decision processes. This goes, of course, way back. Adam Smith wrote about the famous invisible hand, stating that under certain circumstances that a decentralized decision-making in market economies will promote social welfare. And economists spent a century and a half after Adam Smith, from then through the 1940s, the 1960s, and getting rigorous analysis of the invisible hand. And those became known, and for the students, whether you've studied this or not, you'll hear at some point about the so-called fundamental theorems of welfare economics, which are idealized conditions under which equilibrium outcomes in markets have the desirable welfare property of Pareto efficiency, which would be sought by a planner who's utilitarian or using any other welfare function that attempts to aggregate personal welfare, that respects personal welfare. We want to have Pareto efficiency. Now, the fundamental theorems of welfare economics may be very beautiful mathematically, but they don't apply very often in the real world, where we don't have the conditions of a perfect competitive market. So we have a huge field of public economics that tries to be informative about more realistic planning situations. Even in that setting, Pareto efficiency continues to be a benchmark for measuring the inefficiency of outcomes. And it's also a benchmark in social choice theory, which studies the outcomes produced by voting and other decentralized mechanisms that attempt to aggregate preferences. Now, the issue where my work begins is that the norm in the literature in public economics has been to assume that the planner knows enough about the choice environment to be able to determine an optimal action. And that's unrealistic. So what I write here is, however, the consequences of decisions are often highly uncertain. I would really say more than often. I would say most often are highly uncertain. And so how do economists get around that? The long tradition has been to make strong and unfortunately unsubstantiated assumptions and then use those assumptions to study solvable optimization problems in a kind of as-if way. If we knew this, this, and this, then the following would be optimal. I've very much disliked that. I've probably disliked it my entire career, but it didn't really gel, at least in terms of a term, until fairly recently in 2011, in the term that Oliver referred to, incredible certitude, which was a term I still want to go viral, but hasn't yet. And still you can do that. You could do that and get up on Twitter and get it trending on Twitter in the next, it's not Twitter, it's X now, I'm sorry, in the next 10 minutes. So I had an article in the Economic Journal in 2011 on policy analysis with incredible certitude. And what that means is you act as if something is certain, certitude, but there's no credibility to it. And so you just make believe stuff that you know stuff that you don't really know, and then you optimize doing that. Economists differ on what drives us in kind of a red button issue that gets us upset and ranting on and hopefully trying to do something useful. Incredible certitude drives me crazy. But I try not simply to rant about it. I try to actively do research on how to stop it and get around it. So there's a couple of sites here. One of the EJ article in 2011, and then there's a book called Public Policy in an Uncertain World, a Harvard University Press book in 2013, that's aimed at a broad audience, certainly readable by the undergraduates here today, if you want to see more on incredible certitude. And I'll come back to it a bit later. Now, why am I bothered by planning with incredible certitude? It harms society in multiple ways. The most obvious way is that if you're going to set up an optimization problem, and I say, and give a recommendation to policymakers that this particular policy choice will maximize social welfare, but you've got the wrong description of the environment or the wrong social welfare function, then you can say it's optimizing, but real people are going to be worse off, not better off. So that's not good. So that's pretty straightforward. But then there's somewhat more subtle ways in which incredible certitude hurts. One is that if you act as if you know everything, then there's no need to do new research. And of course, all of us know that we do need to do new research. And if you're a consultant to a policymaker, advising a government panel and say, this is the right thing to do, and we know it, then they're not going to understand the need for doing further work, and that's bad. Third, which is even more subtle, is that there are strategies for dealing with uncertainty that are very important, but that never show up at all if you think you know everything. So one of them is this idea of diversification. People understand diversification for financial planning. Why do you want a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds in financial planning? It all comes from uncertainty. If you knew the returns from stocks and bonds, you would never diversify. Well, the same issue shows up in public policy. So that's going to be my topic tomorrow, is to actually formally derive diversification as a sensible strategy for certain kinds of public policy and other planning problems. Now, when I say this has been very, very little work, I've had a sense of that, but I wanted to be sure I hadn't missed something. There's a comprehensive and very, very good textbook by Atkinson and Stiglitz, 1980, but it's still, very, very good for teaching PhD level public economics. I looked at the Atkinson and Stiglitz textbook, and there's only a few mentions of uncertainty or anything similar to that in the entire book, and then it's only in passing. And it's not that Tony Atkinson or Joe Stiglitz are naive or anything. These are, very, very good. Joe Stiglitz is still with us, economist, and why they didn't get into uncertainty, I don't know, but it's not there in the book. So I wanted to address this problem of the reluctance of research in welfare economics to come to grips with uncertainty, and that's what's motivated my research over the past 20 years. I use the word credible. Credible is a very tough word to pin down. It's subjective. I looked it up once in the online Oxford English Dictionary, and for a definition of credible, and it said credible. It was the definition was having credibility, and then I looked up credibility, and it said plausibility, and yes, it's true. I looked up plausibility, and then it said credibility, and it actually did go full circle. And I said, I can't define it, but we sort of know what it means. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the time today and then tomorrow is to describe the themes of my work and applications. Just for before I get into it, you say, well, what other work of this type is there? Very little that I know of. Back in 1978, Johansson, leading macroeconomist, had a textbook in which he decried the absence of work under uncertainty in macroeconomic planning. And here's a quote. You can read the whole thing from what Johansson wrote, but I'll just quote his last line. Johansson says, instead of being a peripheral issue, sometimes uncertainty is the heart of the matter when decisions are to be taken. Now, he didn't actually follow up on that. The only sustained line of work in macroeconomics that I know of that's really tried to follow up on that is more recent. It's basically contemporaneous with my own work, and that's by Lars Hansen and Tom Sargent. Some of you, if you have a macro background, may know of this on robust macro policy is what they call it. And their work, in a big picture, we have a lot in common. In the specifics, there's a lot of technical differences and also differences in perspective and some philosophical differences between what Lars and Tom are doing and what I'm doing. I don't have any time to get into what they're doing. I view their work as kind of, on the whole, with fellow travelers in the same direction, but with a lot of differences between us. Okay. So now so that's like the first level of peeling back this topic. Now let me talk a bit about decision theory. Because the formal apparatus for studying decision-making under uncertainty is the kind of work that's done in decision theory. Now, the basic problem that decision theorists have wrestled with formally for a long time is immediately clear in a very, very simple setting. If you have just two feasible actions, call them action A and B, and two possible choice environments, call them S1 and S0, S2 here, I'm sorry, S1 and S2. The symbol S is because the decision theorists talk about a state of nature as a possible environment. So S is state 1 and state 2. And just imagine that action A yields higher welfare in state 1, S1, and B yields higher welfare in state S2, and you don't know which is the correct description of the world, then you can't maximize welfare. Even in the simplest situation as that, you cannot maximize welfare if there are two states of nature and two actions, and one's best in one state of nature and the other's best in the other state of nature. Well, if you can't optimize, then what are you going to do? I've taken, like, credibility as a kind of soft word that you sort of have to I use but can't define fully. Another one of that type is I talk often about making a reasonable choice. And if you can't make an optimal choice, justifying the word reasonable is tricky, and this is why you do need the math and getting rigorous about this, because the literature differs on what people think is reasonable or not, and just talk is not going to get you there, okay? You've got to flesh it out. So there are various principles for reasonable decision-making under uncertainty, and I'll say a bit more about that a bit later today. One thing I want to point out is decision theory is not particularly connected to social planning or public policy making. Decision theory is a very abstract field. It says there's decision maker and there are actions, and the decision maker chooses what the decision maker does. The decision maker could be an individual, it could be a firm, it could be a planner. Most of decision making is just at that very abstract level. There's a little bit of decision theory that gets tied particularly to public decision making, but I won't have time to discuss that. As I said, the unknown aspects of the environment are called states of nature. So we have a state space, that's all the possibilities for what could happen in the world. And the basic formalization of uncertainty is the listing of items in the state space. The bigger the state space is, the more the possibilities that could happen. For decision theory to get going, you have to list those things. There's some of you may know the distinction between known unknowns and unknown unknowns. It became very well known in the United States after Donald Rumsfeld made what's now a famous statement about that in the Iraq War, and about whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction or not. Decision theory is about known unknowns. You have to list the possible states of nature. I'm not aware of any, maybe someone in the audience knows something I don't, but I'm not aware of any rigorous formal work that succeeds in dealing with the problem of unknown unknowns. There's only so far you can go, and it's tough enough to deal with known unknowns. So that's what we're going to be doing here. Now, in addition to the state space, a large part of decision theory goes further and puts a probability distribution down on the state space. And you say, okay, we'll do that. We'll put a probability distribution down, and we'll maximize expected utility. That's, if you're an economist and you're studying decisions under uncertainty, that's typically the way you're going to go about it. You've got to be a little bit careful because, well, for a variety of reasons. The one I want to mention is that there are two notions of probability distributions in decision theory. One is that a probability distribution is a cognitive concept, whether it's an objective distribution or a subjective distribution, that that there's actually some body to a probability distribution, and you take your probability distribution and put it across the state space, maximize expected utility, and so on. The other part of the other perspective on probability distribution comes from what's called axiomatic decision theory, which some of you may have studied and others not, and that does not view a probability distribution as some real psychological or cognitive notion. It's rather a mathematical construct that's supposed to be derived from observing choices, or at least hypothetical choices, okay? And these are very, very different notions, but they're related to one another in the decision theory literature, for those of you who are familiar with this, through what are called representation theorems. Now, I want to just talk a bit about axiomatic decision theory, which is very important to some economists, but it's not important to me. And the reason why I want to talk about it for a minute or two is to explain why it's not important to me, even though actually some colleagues of mine in my own department and many very good economists spend their career doing axiomatic theory. So I want to explain why this is not going to come up afterwards in my own discussion. So axiomatic decision theory poses principles, which are called axioms, for consistency of hypothetical behavior across a class of potential choice problems. Probably the best known axiom would be transitivity, that even undergraduates would see. Others, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Savage's sure thing principle, this on and on and on. They're principles of consistency across hypothetical choices, that you shouldn't be inconsistent across choice problems. Now, how do you come up with the axioms? Well, it comes from introspection. Even Leonard Savage, kind of maybe the the preeminent person in this field, he introspected when he came up with his axioms, which he took very seriously. And it's worth actually reading the first chapter of Savage's famous book on Foundations of Statistics, where he discusses this openly, how he introspected to come up with his axioms. He went beyond calling them reasonable. He called them necessary principles for rationality, which goes even further. The central research activity of axiomatic decision theory is to pose and prove representation theorems, as I mentioned, establishing that adherence to a specified set of axioms is equivalent mathematically to acting as if one wants to maximize some welfare function, coping with uncertainty in some manner. Now, there's a very large literature on this. The most famous pieces of work were done in mid-century, the last century, one Savage in 1954 that I mentioned, and then 10 years earlier, von Neumann Morgenstern in the theory of games and economic behavior in 1944. They both come up with the same result, basically, that people will act if they adhere to their axioms as if they're maximizing expected utility. The big difference is, of course, how they deal with probability distributions. To von Neumann Morgenstern, the probability distribution is given from the outside. It's that cognitive or external view of a probability distribution as a real object. In Savage, the probability distribution is purely a mathematical construct. Okay? Now here's why don't I do axiomatic decision theory? It's because of the last sentence on this slide, because in neither theorem, neither von Neumann Morgenstern nor Savage, does the distribution have any necessary connection to objective reality. It's all about internal consistency, not about connection to objective reality. You might think, well, von Neumann Morgenstern, people talk about that as decision-making under risk, as if there's there's an objective probability distribution. But there's nothing in the mathematics of von Neumann Morgenstern that requires the probability distribution that's used to be objectively correct. Mathematically, it's just given from the outside. It's not necessarily correct. In Savage, of course, it's just, there is no cognitive probability distribution at all. It's just derived internally into the theory. So I put this into bold here, that I write, again, axiomatic decision theory provides no description of substantively good decisions. And this is critical for me, because if I think about public policy planning or other social planning, it's not going to be enough for me that decisions be internally consistent with one another. I want them to be good decisions in a substantive sense, okay? At least I think that's what we should be caring about. Now, so what kind of decision theory is that? Well, that has a long tradition too. Rather than axiomatic decision theory, that's consequentialist decision theory. And that's basically what economists use day in and day out, even without using the philosophical term of consequentialism. That's basically what economists do in all of our applied work. And there you take the welfare function and an expression of uncertainty as primitives, and then you try to find a reasonable way to make decisions. Most prevalent recommendation has been maximization of expected utility. Put a probability distribution down somehow, and choose an action that maximizes expected value of welfare. Now, if I were going to be doing just that, then I wouldn't be having anything new methodologically to say. In terms of my own, hopefully, contributions to this. I could go do applied work in that vein, and it might be perfectly fine applied work, but one of the other things that's bugged me for a long, long time, and this comes from my background in econometrics, is, and it's not just bugged me, it bugs lots and lots of people, is where does the probability distribution come from, okay? And is the probability distribution realistic? Macroeconomics for a long time has been built on the principle of rational expectations, which is assuming there is a distribution. And, well, I just happened to, I see Hashem sitting there, was written an entire, Hashem Pezmer, an entire book railing against rational expectations before I was, so I have to mention Hashem here, right? That's just never seemed right to me to assume rational expectations. And you can say, well, be a pure Bayesian and just have subjective probability distribution and go with that. But if the subjective distribution is divorced from reality, you can be perfectly coherent in an axiomatic way, but the decisions are just maybe really bad. So that doesn't work. So you need a credible way to express uncertainty. If you don't want to use a probability distribution, then what are you going to do? So this gets to the kind of theoretical apparatus that I use. There are multiple ways of doing this in the literature. The two most prominent ways are maximin and minimax regret. Maximin, I think I can explain in one sentence. You look at the worst thing that could possibly happen and try to maximize that worst possible thing. That goes back formally at least to von Neumann in 1925 and competitive game theory. It may go back much earlier in human history. Minimax regret is not as well known, but it's a different principle of you want to protect against worst case phenomena, but in a very different way. Is you want to minimize the maximum suboptimality of your decision. You don't know what the right thing is, so anything that you do may be suboptimal. Suboptimality is bad. The word regret comes sort of from psychology. You may feel regret if you choose something suboptimal. You don't know the worst thing that can happen, so you can try to, but you can calculate maximum regret across the set of states of nature, and you try to minimize that. So that goes back to actually to Leonard Savage, the same Savage that we've talked about in 1951. The math of this, you make rigorous. That kind of thing gets cranked out in all of my journal articles and so on. But for here, we'll stick with the verbal description. This is all consequentialist rather than axiomatic decision theory. The objective is to make substantively good decisions in particular settings. You want to specify a welfare function, express uncertainty in a credible way, and then go ahead. And everything has to be context specific. Some kind of very broad principle is not going to get very far. You really have to dig in to particular problems in order to, I think, to make progress on this. Okay. Now, this is where the econometrics comes in. For my entire career, I've studied identification problems in econometrics, which are, as opposed to, I've also studied statistical imprecision, but mostly identification, which is the problems that don't go away as sample size increases. In conventional statistics, the problem is having finite samples, and as you get bigger and bigger sample size, you learn more and more and eventually converge on the truth. So we have consistent estimates in econometric theory. But identification problems, this is where econometrics began as a field in the 1930s and 1940s with the study of linear simultaneous equation systems to describe markets. Those are identification problems. Even if you could collect a sample of infinite size, there are things that you can't learn from the nature of the data that you're collecting. And so I see identification problems all over empirical research in economics, and all of those identification problems that show up in empirical economics, they then imply uncertainties for public policy and other social planning. Okay? Now, for myself, I'm going to read an entire quote for myself in 2000 because in retrospect, this is where occasionally, we all go about doing our research, but then you hit a point and you find something new and then your research changes direction. And that happened in this article in the Journal of Econometrics in 2000. It was on connecting identification problems with decisions under uncertainty. And what I wrote is this paper connects decisions under ambiguity. Ambiguity is the term that I borrow from Daniel Ellsberg for cases where you don't have a probability distribution. Okay, that's, for those of you who aren't aware of it, Ellsberg's term for this. Other terms are deep uncertainty, or macroeconomists talk about Knightian uncertainty. It's all the same thing as problems where you don't have probability distributions. So I wrote this paper connects decisions under ambiguity with identification problems in econometrics. Considered abstractly, it's natural to make this connection. Ambiguity occurs when lack of knowledge of an objective probability distribution prevents a decision maker from solving an optimization problem. Empirical research seeks to draw conclusions about objective probability distributions by combining assumptions with observations. An identification problem occurs when a specified set of assumptions combined with unlimited observations drawn by a specified sampling process does not reveal a distribution of interest. Thus, identification problems generate ambiguity in decision-making. So for me, that was kind of It was kind of percolating in the head, but then it kind of comes together in the research program. So as I mentioned, this word ambiguity, the Ellsberg paper, if for students who have not read it, it's a beautiful paper. It's hardly technical at all, but it's conceptually just brilliant. And it's be a good incentive for PhD students. It came out of his PhD dissertation at Harvard in economics in around 1960, and so if you can do anything remotely like that, you'll be immortal, I think. So that's ambiguity, and as I said, there's also statistical imprecision, which I don't want to downweight, but I think it's less fundamental than identification. Okay, so what are the kinds of problems I've dealt with? So I'm just going to run through quickly the kinds of things that I've written on, and then, as I say, tomorrow we'll flesh one of them out. I've become quite interested in medical risk assessment and prediction of treatment response, and how that, as an econometric problem, and how that affects clinical decision making. There's a whole set of articles that have been written, mostly in econometrics and statistics journals, but I've also written a full book on it, trying to get at a broader audience, maybe a public health or a medical research audience. That's this Patient Care Under Uncertainty in 2019, Princeton University Press book. Also on the medical front, is a kind of separate line of work in which I've worked a little less, but on the spread of infectious diseases, which inform choice of vaccination policy. So there's 2 papers here that I mentioned. I could mention by the side, because I'd love to have more time to talk about it, but I don't, is that I got reinterested in this at the beginning of the pandemic, when I think everyone was familiar with the epidemiological modeling that was being used to hopefully inform COVID policy, both in the UK and the US and elsewhere. And I started looking at the epidemiological models, and I thought there was incredible certitude to the 10th power in the epidemiological models. I could go on at quite some length about that. The heart of that was in London and Imperial College. It wasn't in Cambridge, as far as I know, so I'm hoping I'm not insulting someone who's sitting here. But that was it's a very serious issue, okay? And lots and lots of uncertainty. Much more recently, just in the past few years, I've begun to work with a couple of colleagues on climate change. Lots of uncertainties there. Uncertainty in the physical science models that are used to forecast future temperature. Will global mean temperature 100 years from now, will it be 1.5 degrees centigrade above current temperature, 2 degrees, 2.5? The physicists don't agree. They work very, very hard, and they have very sophisticated computational models built on deep physical principles, but there's still a lot that they don't know. For example, on the formation of cloud cover and heat transfer and CO2 transfer from the oceans into land in the atmosphere. So there's lots of uncertainties there, and they really matter. First paper that I wrote with Alan Sanstead and Steve DeCanio, my co-authors, was just published 2 years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And then we did a second paper that has much more economic content, where we get into uncertainty about what discount rate to use, which has been an enormously controversial question, a particularly economic question. So that's our paper. That's an EE, that's ecological economics. Other areas that have been of interest to me, there's a vast set of identification problems that arise when studying the preferences and behavior of populations. There are 2 separate reasons why we need to understand preferences and behavior of populations when we're studying policy. One is if you want to predict what will happen under a given policy, and people, their incentives, and people react to the incentives, then you have to understand their behavior. So a classic case of this is income tax policy. I always take as my starting point for this Jim Murley's seminal optimal income taxation paper from 1971. It was just a wonderful piece of work. It's deterministic. But Murley's, if you read it, Murley's was very, very clear in his discussion that he's worried about uncertainties but it is deterministic in what he did. And because if you want to forecast tax revenues, then you need to know how people are going to react to tax policy. The other aspect of this is that if you're going to be utilitarian, then you need to know preferences, because you need to know what welfare function to use. Murley's specified a particular, he assumed homogeneous preferences in a particular utility function as a utility as a function of income, as a diminishing marginal utility. We don't know if that's right. Murley's didn't know that that's right. He was very aware of that. But if you want to do a realistic policy planning, you have to know people's preferences. There are huge identification problems there. So I have two articles back in 2014, one in the journal Quantitative Economics and the other in the Economic Journal. And I've also done work on policing as a social planning problem. And there the issue is deterrence of crime, is how increasing policing may deter crime, okay? So there are lots and lots. I'm just talking about the problems that I've studied just very, very briefly. Okay, that goes back to the second level of what I want to talk about. Now let me just go on a bit more, without going over time. A bit more about planning with incredible certitude. I think it's pretty clear-cut that these uncertainties exist. So I think it gets hard to argue as to why the literature generally ignores uncertainty and studies things with incredible certitude. And, you know, I don't have a full answer, but as an economist, I can conjecture that the research community responds to incentives. And what are the incentives? Well, there are incentives inside the research community to publish firm results. Some of the, students may not know this, but faculty, when we talk among ourselves, you know, over lunch or beer or whatever, we bemoan the status of the profession quite a lot, and at least some of us do. And one of the things that we bemoan is that you can find really superbly performed research that just does everything right, but the results turn out to be wishy-washy. You know, that in this circumstance, you just can't pin down some really exciting result. And we say to each other, well, that stuff should be published in a good journal. And then we say, well, is that stuff published in a good journal? And then we all say, well, it's really tough to get that stuff published in a good journal because referees and editors want stuff that looks exciting. And then we blame each other because we all act as referees and editors, and so we know this is some of our own fault. But that is the way it is, and that's inside the research community. And then if you go outside the research community, if you're trying to advise on public policy, you know, to real policymakers, then it's even more so. They don't, you know, how many of them have the background to really understand the subtleties and the nuances, and they just want to get good policy advice. So, so there really are strong incentives to do things with incredible certitude. I'll also mention that there's a very long history of this in philosophy of science, particularly with Occam's razor and the notion that if you have multiple theories or hypotheses, you know one's right, choose the simplest. I don't know what simplest means, but even without that issue of what simplest means, the idea that you should choose one out of many hypotheses when you don't know which is right, logically that doesn't make sense to me. I'd rather just say you just don't know. But philosophers of science have long argued about whether you should just admit that or still choose one that's supposedly best in some sense. I'll just skip this slide. Thinking about running out of time, about something I really do need to talk about for today is not about uncertainty, but rather the characterization of social welfare, which is, of course, very, very difficult. This question has vexed both economists and philosophers in broad terms and policy analysts in particular contexts for a couple of centuries. And most economic work tries to aggregate personal welfares across the population. There's no theoretical way to do that. Whatever hope there had been that you could somehow have a mechanism to figure out what social welfare function democracy would agree on. Ken Arrow in 1950 basically, you know, he torpedoed that. So what are you going to do? Well, there was an effort effort that began here in England in the 1930s and 40s, and then spread. It was, very, very important effort. It's what I learned when I was in graduate school. It was back then, it was called the New Welfare Economics. It was started by Caldor and Hicks in 1939. And they said, look, the real problem in doing policy planning is that some people are going to be made better off and some people are going to be made worse off. And we're economists. What right do we have to put values on things to say, who should gain and who should lose with policy planning? So let's see how far we can get without that. And so they invented what was called the New Welfare Economics. And that basically focused 100% on Pareto efficiency, because everyone could agree that if you could go out to the frontier and make everyone better off, then that's great. When I was a PhD student, that's what we studied, was Pareto efficiency. And the problem is that, of course, Pareto efficiency gets you only so far. And everybody, these are very smart, good economists at the time who were trying to get around the problem of interpersonal utility comparisons. They couldn't. And eventually, the Pareto efficiency remains a very important idea. That branch of the public economics literature kind of died down. I quote here John Chipman and John Moore in 1978. They wrote, in this paper we shall argue that judged in relation to its basic objective of enabling welfare prescriptions without value judgments, and in particular interpersonal comparisons of utility, the new welfare economics must be considered a failure. I don't blame the people who are doing that work, Chipman and Moore. It's just, you can't do it. You can't avoid the interpersonal comparisons. So how's that going to happen? The most common way in economics to do it has been utilitarian, and that's almost universally cited back to Jeremy Bentham in 1776, and that's the actual quote of Bentham's famous words about the greatest good for the greatest number, or the specific language he used in at least one place, although Bentham's restated it in many different ways throughout his book. The only point I want to make is you can respect individual preferences but not be utilitarian. In modern times, the most famous alternative to utilitarianism has been Rawls' work in 1971 on what he called the theory of justice, and he basically used the maximum criterion. But Rawls has a whole book devoted to that, and that's had more impact on philosophy and outside of economics than inside economics, but it also respects individual preferences. We sometimes go out of that. Amartya Sen has written on this quite a bit, and as various other people have. Sen called this notion of respecting personal preferences as welfarism. That term just doesn't strike me as right. So I hate to do this to Amartya, but I'm relabeling it as personalism rather than welfarism, because it's all built on personal welfare. The important distinction that Amartya Sen and many other people have made is that society as a whole may care about things based on ethical principles of some sort, fairness, justice, equity, that are not simply aggregating personal preferences. I'm going to take just a minute of the small amount of time I have left to tell you about how I've become entangled in this personally very recently. I have a cite here to Manski, Malay, and Venkatramani, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences 2023. This paper just came out 2 months ago. And this is about, I said I've been doing work on medicine. This is much more an American issue than a UK or continental issue right now, but it's a very hot American issue, is that if you think about medical risk assessment where you're trying to predict illness or predict treatment response, if you have any econometric or statistical background, what everybody knows is that you should try to get as much information about the patient as you can to do the best job of prediction. And it's all regression. Or computer scientists would, I hate to say the word, but they'll call it machine learning, but it's the same thing, is that you want to predict an outcome, predict Y given X, and you want to know as much about X as possible. And leave aside statistical imprecision questions from small samples. So you like to know, the doctor should want to know as much as possible about the patient. That's what's gone on. Since roughly about 2015, and then actually accelerating since then, inside the American medical system, there has been a strong movement to actually eliminate the use of a predictor variable that does over and over again have predictive power. And that's the classification of race or ethnicity. It's usually framed as race, but it could be also ethnicity. And even if, in cases where it does have predictive power, you say you still shouldn't use it. The arguments that have been made have been, this has all occurred in the medical journals, not in economics or in social science journals. And the arguments that have been made is that it is unfair or inequitable or whatever to use race as a predictor. They're verbal arguments, and they do not write down. You can do rigorous analysis with a non-utilitarian social welfare function in which society places value on some notion of fairness or equity, well defined. Unfortunately, what's gone on in the leading medical journals has been verbal discussion. And arguments that have made, I don't have the time to go through it, but you can read what we wrote, because we criticized this pretty heavily, and we took basically a utilitarian perspective on this in our paper, is they say that race is not a cause of illness, and so therefore it should not be used. Or that race is a social construct and not biological, and therefore should not be used in prediction. But this prediction question, as far as we can see, is basically about statistical association. Causality should not matter, and whether race is social or biological should not matter. It should simply be whether it has predictive power. And there are other arguments as well, okay? So I mentioned that because it is an area that I'm working on currently, and it does certainly move with these issues of non-utilitarian welfare and notions of fairness can be very, very important. But if we're going to do it, and I think society should entertain notions of welfare that are not utilitarian, then we should do it rigorously. You shouldn't just talk about justice and fairness and equity. That's the message for today. So what do? Well, it's hard to, there is no name for it in literature, but I talk about, and I should say in the background, I'm talking for these slides, there is a full, long working paper with this same title about credible social planning under uncertainty that's on my webpage, and all of this is fleshed out, and all the full citations are there. I should have mentioned that at the very beginning. Sort of pragmatic welfare functions. I think Murley's was pragmatic in his choice of a welfare function in his optimal income tax study. I give other references here. Barrow in his work of optimal macroeconomic growth in 1990. There's a welfare function, and it's kind of pragmatic. And Bill Nordhaus, I cite on climate policy, is very well-known, famous work on integrated assessment models. There's a pragmatic welfare function. It should have some relationship to the real world, but you don't want to say this. It's got to be just this welfare function. Some combination of having sufficient social acceptability to make the welfare function worthy of study, but not necessarily the one true welfare function. That's the difference with Rawls. Rawls' study had the one true welfare function when he did his theory of justice. And we do kind of hypothetical analysis of what would be optimal in a certain circumstance and so on. And then we go on. That's the perspective of my own work. Okay, now, I've got lots of slides, but I knew I was going to go to the end at this point, so I'm actually not behind. I've got various lengths of this. So I am going to actually skip. For those of you who want math, there's math on these slides, but that's all going to get skipped. And I just want to conclude. Don't worry about the fact that you're missing all this stuff within the slides. This is actually where I intended to get to today. What I want to conclude on is a kind of institutional note on the separation of research on planning and actual planning. And I had made these remarks back in the book in 2013 on Policy in an Uncertain World. So if you do decision theory of the type that I was mentioning, the decision maker in decision theory and the researcher are the same person. Okay? This is a unitary entity and decision maker. There's someone who has to make a decision in the real world. They have certain information. They learn what they can. They deal with uncertainty, and they go about. But that's not the way it actually takes place in the real world, at least not in public policy. That may be for the parent and the family the way it actually happens, and it may be to some extent for the clinician. But if you think about public policy, we have this sharp institutional separation that some of us do the research, and then we feed the research to planning people who actually make the policy decisions. And in principle, this makes perfect sense. Very elementary principle of economics is division of labor, and so having division of labor where we do the research and then try to inform the policymakers, that makes perfect sense. The problem is that it hasn't been working out as well as it should. And the reason why it hasn't been working out as it should is this incredible certitude. It's because for this division of labor, it's a principal agent problem, really, in terms of economic theory. The principles of the policymakers, we're their agents, and we want the agents, which is us, to be doing things that serve the functions of the policymakers. But incredible certitude doesn't do that. It's not giving, all too often, it's not giving policymakers the advice that I think we should be giving them. I really want research to face up to uncertainty and explain the uncertainties to policymakers. Now, I've been working in this for 20 years, and I've given lots of talks, and I've become quite I've become quite used to people saying to me, that's naive. If you're a consultant or an advisor in a policy panel, you can't do that. I've heard it stated over and over again, mostly in the US, and I'm sure people are much more subtle and nuanced in the UK, but they say that policymakers are either psychologically unwilling or cognitively unable to cope with uncertainty. They say that. I have not seen any empirical research on that topic. I don't want to say that every policymaker is psychologically able and cognitively able to cope with uncertainty, but surely some of them are. And what I think, and this is my final slide, is that whatever the situation with the policymakers is, I don't think it's innate. I think it's modifiable. I think that if right now policymakers want incredible certitude, that's a cultural norm that hopefully can be changed. And awareness should grow that incredible certitude is harmful. And then the cultural norm will be that researchers should be honest and face up to uncertainty and not act as if they know things that they don't really know. So that's the big picture. And I want to stay on time, so we're going to stop right there.